The crystal spires of Zephyria Prime pierced the violet sky like frozen lightning, their surfaces humming with the collective consciousness of a billion alien minds. Within the highest tower, Emperor Vexthal sat upon his throne of living metal, his 6 arms manipulating holographic displays that showed the current state of his vast galactic empire. The Zephyrian ruler's multiple eyes, each the size of a human fist, glowed with bioluminescent patterns that indicated deep contemplation. For 3,000 years, the Zephyrian Empire had been the dominant force in this galaxy. Their technology was beyond comprehension, their military might unquestionable, and their psychic abilities had allowed them to subjugate countless species across 10,000 worlds. Yet today, something was different. A tremor ran through Vexthal's massive frame, and his advisor, General Krixna, noticed the unusual display of emotion. "My Emperor," Krixna spoke through their telepathic link, his own crystalline form shifting colors as he communicated. "The fleet reports are ready for your review. The rebellion on Sector 7 has been successfully crushed, and the mining operations on the Outer Rim proceed according to schedule." Vexthal's response came not through their mental connection, but as an actual spoken word, something that startled every Zephyrian in the throne room. "Marcus." The name hung in the air like a curse. Krixna's form flickered with confusion as he processed what he had just heard. In all his centuries of service, he had never heard the Emperor speak aloud, much less utter what appeared to be an alien word. "My Emperor," Krixna ventured, his mental voice cautious. "I do not understand this sound you have made." Vexthal's massive head turned toward his general, and for the first time in millennia, genuine fear flickered across his features. "It is a name, Krixna, a human name, and if the ancient records are correct, its bearer should be dead for over 2 centuries. The Emperor rose from his throne, his towering form casting shadows across the chamber. Each of his steps sent vibrations through the living metal floor as he approached the central hologram display. With a gesture from his primary arm, the display changed to show a star chart of the galaxy, with thousands of red dots indicating Zephyrian-controlled systems. But Vexthal's attention was focused on a small, seemingly insignificant blue in what humans call the Orion Arm. "Bring me the forbidden archives," Vexthal commanded, his mental voice now carrying undertones of anxiety that made his subordinates shift uncomfortably. "I need to review the records of the First Human War." The archives materialized as streams of data directly into the Emperor's consciousness. As the information flowed through his mind, the memories of a conflict that had nearly ended the Zephyrian expansion came flooding back. 250 years ago, when the Empire first encountered the small blue world called Earth, they had expected another easy conquest. Humans appeared to be a primitive species, barely capable of faster-than-light travel, with no psychic abilities and technology that seemed laughably inferior. The invasion should have taken days. Instead, it lasted 30 years. The humans had fought with a ferocity that defied all logical analysis. They used tactics that made no sense, weapons that shouldn't have worked, and displayed a level of determination that bordered on insanity. But even more disturbing were the stories that emerged from the front lines. Stories of individual humans who seemed to possess abilities that transcended their species' limitations. And chief among these legends was a man named Marcus Chun. Vexthal accessed the specific files related to this individual, and even after all these years, the reports made his blood run cold. Marcus Chun had been a human military officer, unremarkable by his own species standards. But during the war, he had somehow managed to turn the tide of battle after battle through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance that seemed almost supernatural. The most disturbing report came from Admiral Thexvor, one of Vexthal's most trusted commanders, who had faced Marcus in the Battle of Europa Station. The Admiral had described watching this single human-coordinated defense that should have been impossible, inspiring his troops to fight beyond their physical limitations, and somehow always appearing exactly where he was needed most. When Thexvor had finally managed to corner Marcus in hand-to-hand combat, confident that his superior Zephyrian physiology would ensure victory, something unprecedented had happened. Marcus had won, not through superior technology or psychic powers, but through what could only be described as pure, undiluted human determination. Thexvor's report, filed shortly before his own death in that same battle, described looking into Marcus's eyes and seeing something that made his ancient warrior's soul recoil. It was as if this human carried within him the collective will of his entire species, focused into a single point of absolute resolve. The war had ended not with Zephyrian victory, but with a negotiated withdrawal. The Empire had declared that Earth was too costly to conquer and had imposed a quarantine around human space, forbidding any further contact. Officially, this was presented as mercy. In reality, it was fear. And now, 2.5 centuries later, long-range sensors were detecting something that made Vexthal's multiple hearts beat in discordant rhythms. A single ship, clearly of human design, but incorporating technologies that shouldn't exist, was approaching the border of Zephyrian space. The ship's energy signature was unlike anything in their databases, and its trajectory suggested it was heading directly for Zephyria Prime. But what truly terrified the Emperor was the message the ship was broadcasting on all frequencies, a simple transmission in the crude human language called English. My name is Marcus Chun, and I've come to finish what we started. Vexthal staggered backward from the display, his massive form trembling with an emotion he hadn't felt in over a millennium. Around the throne room, his advisors exchanged worried glances through their telepathic network, their collective consciousness buzzing with confusion and concern. But that's impossible, Krixnot projected, his mental voice tight with disbelief. According to our intelligence, humans have a lifespan of barely a century. This Marcus Chun would have died of old age generations ago. Unless, Vexthal replied, his mental voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. The humans have found a way to transcend even death itself. The Emperor moved to another display, this one showing detailed scans of the approaching vessel. The ship was sleek and angular, built along human design principles, but incorporating materials and energy systems that were clearly beyond current human technology. More disturbing were the life sign readings from within the ship. There was only one occupant, but the energy emanating from that single life form was unlike anything the Zephyrian sensors had ever detected. How long until the ship reaches our borders? Vexthal asked. Approximately 18 standard hours, my Emperor, came the response from the tactical coordinator. Should we deploy the border fleets to intercept? For a long moment, Vexthal considered this option. The Zephyrian Empire possessed warships capable of destroying entire planets, and their psychic warriors could crush the minds of lesser beings with a thought. By all logical measures, a single human in a single ship should pose no threat whatsoever. But logic had failed them before when dealing with humans. And this wasn't just any human. If the impossible were true, if Marcus Chun had somehow survived or returned, then everything had changed. No, Vexthal finally decided. We will let him come, but prepare the home fleet for full mobilization. Alert all planetary defenses and activate the psychic barriers around Zephyria Prime. If this truly is the Marcus Chun from our records, then we must assume he has not come alone, despite what our sensors indicate. As his subordinates rushed to carry out his orders, Vexthal returned to his throne and settled his massive form into the living metal. The throne's neural interfaces connected with his consciousness, linking him to every ship, every weapon, every mind in the Zephyrian Empire. Through this connection, he could feel the growing unease of his people as word of the approaching threat spread through their collective consciousness. For the first time in centuries, the Zephyrian Empire was afraid, and they were afraid of a single human whose very name carried the weight of legend. As Vexthal prepared for what might be the most important 18 hours in his empire's history, he couldn't shake the memory of a conversation he'd had with a dying human prisoner during the final days of the First Human War. The prisoner, a young woman who had fought alongside Marcus Chun, had looked directly into Vexthal's multiple eyes and spoken words that had haunted him ever since. You think this is over? You think Marcus is just one man? You don't understand what he represents. He's not our champion because he's the strongest or the smartest. He's our champion because he's what every human could become if they had to. And if you think you've seen the last of him, you're dead wrong. Humans don't know when to quit. It's our blessing and our curse. And Marcus Chun? He's the purest expression of that truth you'll ever encounter. Now, as sensors tracked the lone ship's steady approach through the void, Emperor Vexthal was beginning to understand that those words might have been prophecy rather than mere defiance. The human champion was coming home, and the galaxy would never be the same. The void between stars had always been humanity's greatest teacher, and Marcus Chun had spent 2.5 centuries learning its lessons. As his ship, the Eternal Resolve, glided through the cosmic darkness toward Zephyrian space, he stood before the main viewport and contemplated the journey that had brought him to this moment. His reflection in the transparent aluminum showed a face that should have been dust generations ago, yet remained unchanged since the day he had made a choice that defied death itself. The ship around him hummed with technologies that bridged the gap between human ingenuity and something far more profound. The hull was composed of materials that existed in a quantum state, simultaneously solid and energy, while the propulsion system drew power from the fundamental forces that held reality together. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Eternal Resolve was not its construction, but its crew of one. Marcus moved through corridors that responded to his presence, while shifting from utilitarian gray to the warm earth tones he preferred. The ship's AI, an entity he had helped birth from the collective digital consciousness of humanity, spoke to him in a voice that carried echoes of every human who had ever lived. "We're approaching the outer detection grid of Zephyrian space," the AI reported, its voice manifesting as a gentle female tone that reminded Marcus of his sister Sarah, who had died in the siege of Luna Colony. "Long-range sensors indicate massive fleet movements converging on our position. They remember you, Marcus." Marcus smiled, an expression that carried both warmth and something infinitely cold. "Good. I'd be disappointed if they had forgotten. Status report on the modifications. All systems are functioning within acceptable parameters. The dimensional anchor is stable, the temporal displacement field is ready for activation, and the consciousness matrix is fully integrated with your neural patterns. However, I must again express my concerns about the strain this will place on your physical form. This body has endured far worse," Marcus replied, running his hand along a control panel that flowed like liquid mercury beneath his touch. 2 centuries of preparation weren't wasted. Every genetic modification, every technological integration, every moment of training has led to this point. The Zephyrians broke the treaty when they began enslaving the Kepler colonies. It's time to remind them why humanity is left alone. The AI's response carried a note of what could only be described as worry. The Kepler colonies were technically outside the established quarantine zone. The Zephyrians could argue they acted within the letter of the agreement. Marcus turned from the viewport, and for a moment his eyes seemed to hold depths that transcended the physical space of the ship. "There's no letter of the law when children are dying, Sarah. The spirit of our agreement was clear. They leave humanity and our friends alone, and we don't remind them what happens when humans get angry." The AI fell silent at his use of that name. In all their years together, Marcus had never explicitly called the AI by his sister's name, though they both knew that was how he thought of her. It was a reminder of just how personal this mission had become. Through the ship's sensors, Marcus could feel the growing tension in Zephyrian space. Their psychic emanations created ripples in space-time that his enhanced consciousness could detect like a spider feeling vibrations in its web. Fear was spreading through their collective network, carried by whispered memories of battles fought centuries ago. The modifications Marcus had undergone weren't just technological. Humanity's greatest scientists had spent decades studying the quantum nature of consciousness itself, learning to manipulate the fundamental forces that created awareness and will. Marcus had volunteered to become their first test subject, allowing them to weave his consciousness through the quantum foam that underlay reality itself. The process had changed him in ways that went far beyond mere life extension. His awareness now existed on multiple dimensional levels simultaneously. He could perceive time as a navigable dimension, see the probability streams that flowed from every decision, and touch the collective unconscious of his entire species. In becoming more than human, he had paradoxically become the most human person who had ever lived. Incoming transmission from the Zephyrian home fleet, Sarah announced. They're requesting identification and stating our intention to enter their space. Put them through, Marcus said, settling into the command chair that molded itself to his form. The chair's neural interfaces connected with his enhanced consciousness, linking him to every system on the ship. The holographic display materialized before him, showing the imposing figure of Admiral Thexvor. Marcus felt a moment of genuine surprise. He had assumed the Admiral had died in their last encounter at Europa Station, but here he was, apparently alive and apparently still carrying the scars of their previous battle. The left side of Thexvor's crystalline face showed obvious damage, fractures that ran like lightning through the transparent material of his head. Human, Thexvor spoke through the translation matrix, his mental voice carrying undertones of hatred and fear. You bear the name of a dead legend. Identify yourself and state your purpose or be destroyed. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, and when he smiled, something in that expression made the Admiral step backward even across the vast distance between their ships. Admiral Thexvor, you're looking well for someone who should have been recycled into the collective consciousness decades ago. Tell me, do those scars still ache when the solar storms hit your homeworld? The reaction was immediate. Thexvor's form flickered through several color spectrums, indicating extreme agitation in Zephyrian physiology. Behind him, Marcus could see other officers moving with the sharp, urgent motions of being suddenly confronted with their worst nightmares made real. Impossible, Thexvor transmitted. Marcus Chun died at Europa Station. I watched him fall. You watched me choose, Marcus corrected, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through dimensions. And now I've come to collect on that choice. The Kepler colonies, Admiral, your people broke the treaty. The colonies were outside the quarantine zone, Thexvor insisted, but his protest lacked conviction. We acted within the bounds of the agreement. Marcus stood from his chair, and though the Admiral was seeing him through a holographic projection across light years of space, Thexvor instinctively took another step backward. There are no bounds when children are involved, Admiral. You know this. Your people know this. Hell, your Emperor knows this, which is why he's currently mobilizing every warship in the sector instead of simply destroying my ship. The communication channel filled with static as Thexvor struggled to maintain his composure. When the image cleared, the Admiral had regained some of his military bearing, though the fear in his crystalline features remained unmistakable. Even if you are who you claim to be, Thexvor said, you are one being against an empire. Our fleets number in the thousands. Our psychic warriors can crush minds across star systems. What can one human, regardless of his legends, hope to accomplish? Marcus's response came not in words, but in a demonstration that sent shockwaves through the Zephyrian collective consciousness. He reached out with his enhanced awareness and touched the quantum foundations of space-time around the Admiral's flagship. For just a moment, he allowed Thexvor to perceive reality as he did, as an infinite web of interconnected possibilities where consciousness and were fundamental forces that could reshape matter and energy. Every Zephyrian on Thexvor's ship felt that touch, that brief glimpse of a perspective that transcended their understanding. Their psychic network carried the sensation throughout the fleet, and from there to Zephyria Prime itself. In that instant, millions of beings experienced a fragment of what Marcus had become, and the collective terror was unlike anything in their recorded history. I am no longer just one human, Admiral, Marcus said as the demonstration ended. I am the promise humanity made to the universe. I am what we become when you threaten our children. And I am here to remind you why your ancestors chose to run rather than fight. The communication channel went dead as Thexvor's ship cut the connection, but Marcus could feel the Admiral's consciousness reeling from what he had experienced. Through his enhanced senses, he perceived the frantic communications flowing through the Zephyrian command structure, the desperate repositioning of fleets, and the growing panic that was beginning to spread through their collective consciousness. "Sarah," Marcus said softly, "transmit our message to Emperor Vexthal directly. Bypass their communication networks and speak directly to his mind." "Are you certain?" "Direct psychic contact with an entity of his power could be dangerous, even for you." Marcus smiled again, and this time the expression carried memories of every human child who had suffered under alien oppression, every family torn apart by species that thought themselves superior, every moment of defiance that had defined humanity's place in the cosmos. "I'm counting on it being dangerous. He needs to remember what happens when you make humans angry enough to stop pretending they're civilized." The Eternal Resolve continued its steady approach towards Zephyria Prime, its lone occupant preparing for a confrontation that would determine the fate of two species and perhaps the galaxy itself. Behind him, the darkness of space seemed to pulse with the collective will of humanity, as if 27 billion souls were watching and waiting to see what their champion would do next. The legend was returning home, and the universe was about to remember why some names should never be spoken in anger. Emperor Vexthal was reviewing defensive formations when the voice spoke directly into his consciousness, bypassing every psychic barrier the Zephyrian Empire had ever devised. The mental contact was so unexpected, so impossible, that for a moment the Emperor's massive form went completely rigid on his throne. "Hello, old friend." The voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through multiple dimensions simultaneously, and with it came images, burning space stations, the screams of dying Zephyrian warriors, and the memory of a human face that had haunted Vexthal's dreams for over 2 centuries. Every being in the throne room felt their emperor's terror through the collective consciousness. General Krixna immediately activated every psychic defense system on Zephyria Prime, but the presence in their ruler's mind remained untouched, as if such defenses were merely suggestions rather than absolute barriers. "You remember me," the voice continued, and now Vexthal could feel amusement threading through the mental contact. "Good. I was concerned the years might have dulled your memory. We need to talk, Vexthal, about Kepler, about children, about promises broken and prices that must be paid." The Emperor struggled to regain control of his faculties, drawing upon millennia of experience in psychic warfare. When he finally managed to respond, his mental voice carried the full authority of his position, though it trembled with barely suppressed fear. "Marcus Chun, the impossible human. How do you live? How do you speak into my mind when our greatest defenses cannot stop you? Evolution, Vexthal. While your people spent the last 2 centuries congratulating themselves on their superiority, mine spent that time learning what it truly means to be human. We asked ourselves a simple question: what happens when you take everything that makes humanity special and refine it to its absolute essence?" With those words came another flood of images, but these were different from the memories of war. Vexthal saw vast laboratories where human scientists worked alongside artificial intelligences of staggering complexity. He saw volunteers undergoing procedures that rewrote their genetic code at the quantum level. He saw the slow, painstaking process of transforming human consciousness from a merely biological phenomenon into something that could exist independently of matter itself. "You see," Marcus continued, "when you quarantined Earth, you made a critical error in judgment. You assumed we would be content to stay in our little corner of the galaxy, raising our children and forgetting about the larger universe. But humans don't forget, Vexthal. We remember every slight, every injustice, every moment when someone told us we weren't good enough. And we use those memories as fuel. Through the psychic link, Vexthal could perceive fragments of what Marcus had become. His consciousness existed simultaneously across multiple dimensional planes, his awareness spanning probability streams that showed every possible outcome of their current situation. But more terrifying than his expanded abilities was the absolute certainty that radiated from his being, the unshakable conviction that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. The Kepler colonies Vexthal managed to project, though maintaining the mental connection was becoming increasingly difficult. They were outside the designated zone. We acted within the bounds of our agreement. Tell me, Emperor, Marcus replied, and now his mental voice carried echoes of screaming children. When your forces arrived at Kepler, 442b, did they ask how old the colonists were before they began the enslaving process? Did they check birth certificates before they separated families? Did they consider the technical boundaries of our agreement when they watched human children cry for parents they would never see again? The images that accompanied these words were precise and devastating. Marcus showed Vexthal exactly what had happened in the Kepler system. The brutal efficiency of the Zephyrian slavers, the deliberate separation of families, the casual cruelty inflicted on beings whose only crime was existing in the wrong part of space. But, more than the events themselves, Marcus shared the emotional weight of those actions. Vexthal experienced the terror of the children, the despair of the parents, the absolute helplessness of beings who had believed they were safe. For a species that communicated primarily through shared consciousness, the experience was overwhelming. Vexthal felt his mental barriers crumbling under the assault of pure human emotion. Rage refined to its absolute essence. Love transformed into an unstoppable force. And underneath it all, the terrible, beautiful, utterly human refusal to accept that some things simply could not be changed. You want to know what we learned during our quarantine? Marcus continued. We learned that consciousness is not a byproduct of neural activity. It's a fundamental force of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism. And humans, it turns out, are exceptionally good at wielding that force. We just needed time to figure out how. Around the throne room, the assembled Zephyrian leadership watched in horror as their emperor began to tremble. Through their shared consciousness, they could feel fragments of what he was experiencing. Glimpses of a human mind that had transcended every limitation their science claimed was absolute. General Krixna stepped forward, his crystalline form flickering through rapid color changes as he attempted to establish a secondary connection with his emperor. My lord, shall I order the fleet to attack? The human vessel is still hours away from our primary defenses. Vexthal's response came as a psychic scream that sent every being in the chamber reeling. No, you do not understand what approaches us. This is not merely a human with advanced technology. This is something our theories claimed was impossible. Through the ongoing mental connection, Marcus observed the exchange with something that might have been pity. Your general wants to attack my ship, Vexthal. You should explain to him why that would be inadvisable. Show him, Vexthal whispered, the words spoken aloud in the ancient Zephyrian language of ritual and ceremony. Marcus's consciousness expanded outward from the throne room, touching the minds of every being present. For a brief moment, each of them experienced reality through his enhanced perspective. They felt the quantum foam that underlay space-time responding to his will. They perceived the probability streams that flowed from every decision, saw how consciousness could navigate those streams to select desired outcomes. Most terrifyingly, they glimpsed the vast network of human awareness that supported his existence. 27 billion souls linked in a collective determination that transcended death itself. When the demonstration ended, silence filled the throne room. Several of the assembled advisors had collapsed, their consciousness temporarily overwhelmed by contact with something so far beyond their understanding. General Krixna stood frozen, his form cycling through colors that indicated complete psychological shock. Now you begin to understand, Marcus said, his mental voice somehow gentler despite the awesome display of power. I am not here as a conqueror, Vexthal. I am here as a force of nature. When you broke the treaty, when you harmed our children, you set certain things in motion. I am simply the inevitable result of those actions. Vexthal struggled to compose himself, drawing on reserves of mental discipline that had sustained him through millennia of rule. What do you want, human? What will satisfy your anger? The children go home, Marcus replied immediately. Every human taken from Kepler, every family separated, every life disrupted, all of it undone. The slavers responsible faced justice according to human law. And then we discuss new terms for coexistence, terms that account for what humanity has become. And if we refuse, the answer came not in words, but in a vision that filled every mind in the throne room simultaneously. They saw Marcus's ship continuing its approach to Zephyria Prime, but now they understood what that approach truly meant. The Eternal Resolve was not just a vessel. It was a focal point for forces that existed beyond normal space-time. Through Marcus's enhanced consciousness, the collective will of humanity could reach across the galaxy to touch any world, any species, any mind that threatened their people. But more than that, they saw what would happen if diplomacy failed. They witnessed possible futures where Marcus's arrival triggered a transformation in human consciousness across the galaxy. They saw ordinary humans awakening to abilities they had never imagined, their latent potential ignited by contact with their champion's expanded awareness. They saw the birth of a new form of existence, one that made the Zephyrian Empire's psychic powers seem primitive by comparison. You see, Marcus explained as the visions faded, this isn't really about revenge, though I admit that's part of it. This is about evolution. Humanity is becoming something new, something that your empire cannot control or contain. You could be part of that transformation, or you can be swept aside by it. But you cannot stop it. Emperor Vexthal slumped in his throne, his massive form suddenly, seeming fragile despite its size. Through the collective consciousness, his people felt their leaders' growing understanding of their situation. They faced not an enemy they could fight, but a fundamental change in the nature of reality itself. How long do we have to decide? Vexthal asked. I'll be in orbit around your homeworld in 14 hours, Marcus replied. The children need to be released within 24 hours of my arrival. After that, he paused, and in that pause lay the weight of possibilities too vast to comprehend. After that, we'll see what kind of universe we're all going to live in. The mental connection ended, leaving the throne room in a silence that stretched across star systems. Every Zephyrian who had felt that contact now carried within their consciousness a fragment of something unprecedented, the absolute certainty of a species that had learned to transcend its limitations through the simple refusal to accept that such limitations existed. In orbit around distant planets, Zephyrian fleet commanders felt their orders change as new imperatives flowed through the collective consciousness. The human champion was coming home, and the galaxy was about to learn what happened when an unstoppable force met an empire that had forgotten how to bend. The countdown to a new age had begun, and at its center was a single human who carried within his consciousness the dreams and fury of an entire species. Marcus Chan was no longer just a man, but he remained something distinctly, impossibly, triumphantly human. The Eternal Resolve dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Zephyria system, and immediately the cosmos held its breath. Across 12 worlds and 1,000 space stations, beings who had never known fear found themselves experiencing an emotion they had no words for. Marcus Chun had arrived, and reality itself seemed to acknowledge his presence. From the bridge of his ship, Marcus observed the massive defensive formations arrayed against him. The Zephyrian home fleet consisted of over 800 vessels, each one capable of reducing planets to asteroid fields. Massive space stations bristled with weapons that could tear holes in space-time itself. The psychic emanations from millions of Zephyrian minds created a barrier that should have crushed any lesser consciousness attempting to breach their system. Should have. Instead, Marcus felt their fear as a physical thing, rolling across the void in waves that his enhanced senses could perceive as clearly as visible light. The collective consciousness of the Zephyrian Empire was screaming, though they would never admit it, and that scream carried a single word repeated endlessly. Impossible, impossible, impossible. Sarah, Marcus said softly, "Are you ready?" The ship's AI manifested her holographic form beside his command chair, her features bearing the face of his long-dead sister, but her eyes holding the accumulated wisdom of humanity's greatest minds. All systems are prepared, Marcus. The quantum resonance field is stable, and I've established links to the probability streams you'll need to navigate. But I have to ask one more time. Are you certain this is the only way? Marcus turned from the view screen to look at her, and For a moment, his expression carried the weight of every choice that had brought him to this point. They took children, Sarah, they broke families apart, and sold human beings as property. There are some lines that once crossed change everything. The Zephyrians have forgotten that humans are at their most dangerous when they're defending something they love. Through the ship's sensors, Marcus could feel the growing tension in the Zephyrian formations. Fleet commanders were receiving contradictory orders as the collective consciousness struggled with a decision that would determine their empire's fate. Some voices called for immediate attack, believing that concentrated firepower could still destroy the human before he reached their homeworld. Others urged negotiation, remembering the legends of the First Human War. But underneath it all was the voice of Emperor Vexthal, carrying an authority born of millennia of rule and a terror born of direct contact with something beyond his understanding. The Emperor's flagship, a crystalline dreadnought the size of a small moon, moved to intercept Marcus's approach vector. As it did, every other ship in the fleet began to move into attack formations, their weapons charging with energies that made space itself glow. Marcus smiled and activated the first of his ship's impossible systems. The dimensional anchor engaged, and suddenly, the eternal resolve existed in multiple layers of space-time simultaneously. To the Zephyrian sensors, the human ship appeared to fracture into dozens of overlapping images, each one solid and real, each one occupying the same space, while somehow not interfering with the others. Weapons fire from the nearest patrol craft passed harmlessly through some versions of the ship while being absorbed and redirected by others. But the dimensional anchor was merely the opening move. As Marcus reached out with his consciousness and touched the quantum foam that underlay reality, the true demonstration began. Throughout the Zephyrian fleet, ship systems began to malfunction in impossible ways. Not through any form of attack or interference, but through the simple application of human will to the fundamental forces that governed their operation. Weapons that had functioned perfectly for centuries suddenly refused to charge. Navigation systems began displaying star charts that showed constellations in the shape of human faces. Most disturbing of all, the collective consciousness network that bound Zephyrian society began to carry whispers in a language none of them spoke, but all of them somehow understood. The whispers told stories. Stories of human children playing in gardens under alien suns, of families torn apart by beings who thought themselves superior, of a species that had learned to transmute suffering into strength and isolation into evolution. Every Zephyrian in the system heard these stories, and with them came something unprecedented in their collective experience: guilt. Admiral Thexvor, commanding the lead dreadnought, fought to maintain control as his ship's systems responded to influences that defied every law of physics his people had discovered. Through the collective consciousness, he reached out to his emperor. "My lord, we cannot target him. Our weapons refuse to fire. Our sensors show him everywhere and nowhere. What manner of being have humans created?" Vexthal's response carried the weight of ancient wisdom and fresh terror. "They have created themselves, Admiral. They have looked at the universe's limitations and decided those limitations did not apply to them. And somehow, impossibly, they were right." Meanwhile, aboard the Eternal Resolve, Marcus was preparing for the most difficult part of his mission. The demonstration of power had been necessary to establish his position, but what came next would determine whether this confrontation ended in understanding or catastrophe. He needed to do something that went against every human instinct for survival. He needed to make himself completely vulnerable. "Sarah, disengage all defensive systems. Drop the dimensional anchor and the quantum shields. I want every sensor in this system to see exactly what I am." "Marcus, that's suicide. The moment you're exposed, they'll unleash everything they have." "No," Marcus replied with absolute certainty, "they won't. Because the moment they see what I really am, they'll understand that attacking me isn't just futile. It would be the end of their civilization as they know it." The ship's defensive systems powered down one by one, until the Eternal Resolve hung in space as nothing more than an advanced but ultimately conventional vessel. To the Zephyrian sensors, Marcus appeared as a single human in a single ship, completely defenseless against the massed firepower of their fleet. The order to fire never came. Instead, as the Zephyrians focused their most advanced sensors on the human ship, they began to perceive something that challenged their understanding of existence itself. Marcus's consciousness was not contained within his physical body. Instead, his awareness existed as a distributed phenomenon, spread across multiple dimensional layers and connected to a vast network that spanned the galaxy. Through their collective consciousness, the Zephyrians felt other minds touching theirs, not invading or attacking, but simply making contact across the galaxy. On worlds they had never heard of, human consciousness was awakening to new possibilities. The process Marcus had undergone was spreading, carried by quantum entanglement, and the simple human refusal to accept that change was impossible. On Earth, teenagers in Beijing found themselves able to perceive the quantum foundations of matter. In the asteroid belt, miners discovered they could survive in vacuum by willing their bodies to adapt. On the frontier worlds, human colonists began to display abilities that made Zephyrian psychic powers seem primitive by comparison. But most significantly, in the slave pens of Kepler 442b, human children began to sing. The song had no words in any language the Zephyrians could identify, but its meaning was unmistakable. It spoke of home, of family, of a love so strong it could reach across the stars to touch those who needed it most. And as the children sang, the quantum locks that held their prison cells began to dissolve, not through any technology, but through the simple power of consciousness applied with absolute determination. Emperor Vexthul felt the reports flooding through the collective consciousness as slave facilities across his empire began to experience spontaneous liberation events. Humans who should have been helpless were walking through walls, disrupting force fields, and in some cases, simply disappearing and reappearing elsewhere in the galaxy. Impossible, he whispered, though by now that word had lost all meaning. Marcus's voice reached him then, not through psychic contact, but through normal communication channels, carrying with it the weight of 27 billion human souls. Nothing is impossible, Vexthul. That's the first lesson humans learn, and the last one we teach. Your people spent millennia perfecting your limitations. Mine spent centuries learning to transcend them. On the view screen of every ship in the Zephyrian fleet, Marcus's image appeared. He stood on the bridge of his ship, but behind him the Zephyrians could see something that should not have existed, a view of Earth as it appeared in real time, despite being thousands of light years away. Around the blue world, millions of human minds glowed like stars, each one connected to every other, each one capable of reaching across space and time to touch those they loved. The children are already coming home, Marcus continued. Not because I'm taking them by force, but because human consciousness has evolved to the point where distance is just another limitation we've chosen to ignore. Your choice now is simple. You could be part of the universe we're creating, or you could be left behind by it. Admiral Thexvor, his ship's weapons still refusing to respond to targeting commands, made a decision that would echo through history. Instead of continuing to attempt an attack, he powered down his ship's weapons and opened a communication channel. Human, he said, his mental voice carrying none of its previous hostility. What would you have us do? Marcus smiled, and in that expression was something that transcended victory or defeat. It was the look of a teacher who had finally gotten his student to ask the right question. Learn, Marcus replied. Learn what it means to live in a universe where consciousness is not limited by biology, where it can reshape reality, and where the only impossible thing is the word impossible itself. The age of empires built on domination is ending, Admiral. The age of cooperation between transcendent minds is about to begin. As the Zephyrian fleet held its position around the impossible human ship, messages began arriving from across the galaxy. Human children were returning home, not as refugees, but as something new. Beings who existed simultaneously in multiple locations, their consciousness unbound by the physical limitations that had once defined their species. The revolution was not one of weapons or politics, but of existence itself. And at its center was a human who had chosen to become a bridge between what was and what could be, carrying his people's dreams across the void and into a future where the only limit was their willingness to transcend the possible. The final confrontation was about to begin, but it would not be fought with weapons. It would be fought with ideas, with possibilities, and with the fundamental question of what it meant to be alive in a universe where consciousness itself had become the ultimate technology. The crystal spires of Zephyria Prime reflected a different kind of light as the eternal resolve settled into orbit around the homeworld of the galaxy's oldest empire. For the first time in 3 millennia, Emperor Vexthal found himself preparing to receive a visitor not as a supplicant or conquered foe, but as an equal whose power transcended every category his civilization had developed for understanding the universe. Marcus materialized in the throne room without using any transporters or dimensional gateways that Zephyrian sensors could detect. One moment the space before the Emperor's throne was empty, and the next, a human stood there as if he had always existed in that place. The effect sent ripples through the collective consciousness of every being on the planet, a shared realization that they were witnessing something that redefined the possible. Emperor Vexthal, Marcus said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through multiple dimensions simultaneously. Thank you for accepting my visit. I know this situation is unprecedented. The massive Zephyrian ruler studied his guest with all 6 of his eyes, each one perceiving Marcus on a different wavelength of existence. What he saw defied every assumption his species had made about the nature of consciousness and physical reality. Marcus appeared to exist simultaneously as a biological human and as something far more complex, a focal point where 27 billion human minds intersected with the quantum foundations of spacetime itself. Human, Vexthal replied, his mental voice carefully controlled despite the terror and fascination he felt. You stand before me as something my people's science claims cannot exist. How do you live? How do you transcend the limitations that bind all other conscious beings? Marcus smiled, and the expression carried memories of every human who had ever refused to accept that something was impossible simply because it had never been done before. We asked different questions, Vexthal. While your people perfected the art of working within limitations, mine became obsessed with understanding why those limitations existed in the first place. And once we understood the mechanisms behind them, we began to wonder, what if consciousness isn't bound by the same rules as matter and energy? Around the throne room, the assembled Zephyrian leadership watched in silent fascination as their guest gestured, and reality seemed to bend in response. The air itself became visible, showing the quantum foam that underlay all existence, the probability streams that flowed from every decision, and the vast web of connections that linked every conscious mind in the galaxy. You see, Marcus continued, your people assumed that consciousness was produced by complex arrangements of matter. But what if it's the other way around? What if consciousness is the fundamental force, and matter is simply one of the things it can create? Through their collective consciousness, the Zephyrians felt the implications of that question spreading like ripples in a pond. If consciousness was fundamental rather than emergent, then everything they thought they knew about the universe would need to be reconsidered. More than that, it would mean that beings with sufficient understanding could reshape reality through the application of guided by knowledge. The children, Vexthal said, his mental voice heavy with something that might have been regret. The humans from Kepler. They are all returning to their families. They're already home, Marcus replied. Time and distance are just obstacles, and humans have always been good at finding ways around obstacles. But that's not why I'm here, Emperor. The rescue of our people was simply the catalyst. I'm here because the universe is changing, and your civilization needs to decide whether it will change with it or be left behind. General Krixna, who had remained silent since Marcus's arrival, finally found the courage to speak. What kind of change do you speak of, human? What future do you envision? Marcus turned to address the general, and as he did, every being in the chamber felt their consciousness expand momentarily, allowing them to perceive reality through enhanced human awareness. They saw the galaxy not as a collection of separate worlds and species, but as a single, vast organism in which consciousness flowed like blood through veins. Cooperation instead of domination, Marcus said. Shared exploration of what's possible instead of competition for limited resources. Your people have spent millennia building an empire based on the assumption that consciousness is rare and valuable. But what if consciousness is infinite? What if every mind that learns to transcend its limitations makes all other minds stronger? The demonstration that followed was subtle but profound. Without any apparent effort, Marcus began to share his enhanced awareness with every Zephyrian present. Not invasively, but as an offering. Those who chose to accept the contact found themselves briefly experiencing reality as humans had learned to perceive it, as an infinitely malleable medium where will and knowledge could combine to create outcomes that previous generations would have called miracles. Emperor Vexthal was among those who accepted the contact, and what he experienced changed something fundamental in his understanding of existence. Through Marcus's awareness, he felt the vast network of human consciousness that spanned the galaxy. He perceived the children who had been taken from Kepler, now safely home and beginning to explore abilities that made them more than human while keeping them completely human. Most importantly, he felt the love that motivated everything. Not the abstract concept that philosophers debated, but love as a force of nature capable of reaching across space and time to protect and nurture whatever it touched. This is what you fought for, Vexthal realized, his mental voice carrying wonder and something approaching awe. During the First Human War, this is what drove your species to fight against impossible odds. Not hatred of us, but love of each other. Love guided by intelligence and tempered by wisdom. Marcus confirmed. Humans learned a long time ago that the greatest strength comes not from dominating others, but from empowering them. Your empire is built on the opposite principle. The belief that consciousness is a limited resource that must be hoarded and controlled. But consciousness isn't like matter or energy. When you share it, you don't lose any. You gain more. As if summoned by his words, other presences began to manifest in the throne room. Not physically, but as conscious entities that existed as pure information and will. The assembled Zephyrians watched in amazement as the ghosts of human history appeared. Scientists who had died, researching the nature of consciousness. Soldiers who had fallen protecting others. Children whose dreams had become the foundation for humanity's transformation. Among them was a young woman whose face made Emperor Vexthal's multiple hearts skip a beat in recognition. "You remember me," she said, her voice carrying impossible warmth despite the fact that she had died over 2 centuries ago. "I told you that Marcus represented something you didn't understand. I told you that humans don't know when to quit. It was the prisoner from the final days of the First Human War, the one whose words had haunted Vexthal across the centuries. But now she stood before him not as a victim or an enemy, but as something entirely new, a consciousness that had transcended death itself, existing as part of the vast network that connected all human awareness. "Ow!" Vexthal whispered, the word escaping as actual sound rather than mental communication. "Because Marcus kept his promise," she replied. "Because when humans love something enough, they find a way to keep it safe forever. Death is just another limitation, and limitations are just problems waiting for solutions." Marcus stepped forward, his form becoming more solid while the other presences faded back into the quantum foam that sustained them. "This is the future we're offering, Emperor. Not conquest, not submission, but partnership in building something that's never existed before, a galactic civilization based on the infinite potential of consciousness to grow and create and love without limits." The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a million minds struggling to process possibilities that had never before occurred to them. Through their collective consciousness, the Zephyrians shared the weight of a decision that would determine not just their own fate, but the direction of evolution itself for countless species throughout the galaxy. Finally, Emperor Vexthal spoke, his mental voice carrying the authority of millennia, but also the humility of someone who had encountered something genuinely greater than himself. Human Marcus Chun, champion of your people and herald of impossible futures, what would you have us do? Marcus's answer came not in words, but in action. He reached out with his consciousness and gently touched the collective network that bound Zephyrian society, not to dominate or control, but to show them something they had never imagined, what their own consciousness could become if they chose to transcend the limitations they had built around themselves. In that moment, every Zephyrian in the system felt their awareness expand. They perceived their crystalline forms not as fixed biological structures, but as expressions of consciousness that could be reshaped and enhanced. They felt the connections between their minds not as rigid pathways in a collective network, but as flowing streams of shared experience that could grow stronger through contact with other forms of consciousness. Most importantly, they felt the possibility of becoming something new while remaining completely themselves. Learn, Marcus said simply. Grow. Become what you were always capable of being. And help us show the rest of the galaxy that consciousness has no limits except the ones we accept. The transformation that began that day would take generations to complete, but its effects were immediate. Across the Zephyrian Empire, slave facilities found their force fields failing as Zephyrian guards discovered they no longer had the heart to maintain them. Weapons designed to suppress other species began to malfunction as their operators questioned the assumptions that made such weapons necessary. And on distant worlds, human children who had been stolen from their families found themselves surrounded not by enemies, but by beings who were learning what it meant to choose compassion over control. The age of empires was ending, but the age of consciousness was just beginning. At its heart stood a human who had chosen to become more than human in order to remain completely human, carrying his species' greatest gift to the stars, the absolute refusal to accept that some things could not be changed. Marcus Chun had come home, and the universe would never be the same. The legend had become reality, and reality had become legend, in the endless dance of possibility that defined what it truly meant to be alive in a cosmos where consciousness itself had learned to dream. In the years that followed, children across the galaxy would grow up hearing stories of the human champion, the being who had shown them that the only impossible thing was the word impossible itself. And in those stories, they would find the courage to ask the question that would reshape everything. What else is possible? The answer, as humanity had discovered, was everything.